Okay, it looks like the gang is all here. We are streaming now.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Then we can go ahead and call into order this Board of Education public hearing for January 24th. This is the first of a few different opportunities for members of the public to make their voices heard in regards to the superintendent's proposed budget. Dr. Da Silva presented her budget to the Board of Education 2 weeks ago on the 10th. The budget presented was $107,356,000, which would represent a 4.98% increase. Looking past over the last 14 years, stretching back to 2010, if passed as in full, it would be only the second year of the last 14 with a budget over 4% increase, and would raise the average budget increase over that 14 years up to a 2.5%. With that said, we do have other times to hear from the public. We have another public hearing scheduled for Saturday morning, February 5th at 10 a.m. We also have public comment at the end of this meeting, and there will also be times for the public to comment to the Board of Finance when our budget goes to them for deliberation as well. So at this point, I will turn it over to Rachel to invite in the first member of the public who would like to comment.
So good evening, everyone. So just as a reminder again, for public hearing, please state your full name and address before going forward, and you will have 3 minutes. First person up is Jason.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for listening to the comment. I think the budget proposal is a strong budget proposal increase tonight. I know that 4.9% might seem like an aggressive increase, but if you look at what's happening out there in the real world today with inflation and the cost of general living going up, plus, frankly, the increase in the town's income, given the increased taxes and the great real estate market we've had lately, I think it's something that's really important that we do to reinvest in our kids. So, I think that this budget is appropriate and fair and will help us keep competitive with what's going on out there in the real world. And I hope that the town considers it as a great starting point for where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan, at this point, I see no other attendees.
Okay, usually we have more voices at the Saturday public hearing anyway, so we will assume to hear from more of our constituents at that point. That said, I can now call to order the special meeting of the Board of Education, and we can start with a Pledge of Allegiance. Everyone off mute with me, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'll keep my report brief this evening. Some of it I already said in the opening remarks. I would like to extend a thank you to the whole board for spending an entire Saturday together, and then coming back for another meeting tonight, as well as another meeting tomorrow night. I know this is always a busy piece of our season, and I appreciate all of you putting in the time for our students. I also want to thank Tina again for stepping in for me on Saturday when I was no longer able to speak. You did a great job, and I appreciate that. One more comment on the budget. While it is a 4.98% increase, I do see this as a conservative budget. There are no new programs to discuss. There are no new toys, no new bells, no new whistles. It is the same school system we had last year and the year before, with the addition of some required and needed help in special education, as well as some help for social and emotional learning, and a couple of other additions in the administrative space. But there's really not much new to discuss tonight. We will go through the budget line by line at that point in the meeting. That is discussion item C. But even though the number is somewhat large, I do see it as a fairly conservative budget. That said, I will pass it on to Dr. Da Silva for her report.
Good evening, everyone. And I echo Jonathan's comments and thanking the board for not only a long Saturday, but a couple of long evenings ahead. And I know many of other days in the coming weeks. Again, thanks. We do have our full day budget videotape online. We had over 325 as of this evening, folks watching it. John Mansfield and Wes worked to have it timestamped. So if you want to look at just one part of the presentation, you don't have to sit through the entire 7 hours. You can log right on to whatever cost center you're most interested in. And I encourage those that are watching to do that, or for those that are watching to encourage their friends, their neighbors, whether they have children in the school system or not. The budget does affect everyone in the community. So please find some time to watch. We have a podcast coming up this week as well to communicate more about the budget, which hopefully, again, those members that are a part of the Ridgefield Public Schools or those members that are not will have the opportunity to listen in. I think we have some good questions planned and a good dialogue. A budget newsletter is in preparations as well. Hopefully we can get that out to the community so they have a sense and understanding of what the budget is comprised of. And my colleagues and I hope to take our superintendent's budget and or the Board of Education budget a little bit on a roadshow in the month of February for as many locations as we can find that will take us and listen to us again and again so that we can communicate what's happening in our schools. And again, it doesn't just impact our children, it impacts the community as a whole. So hopefully we'll offer opportunities that folks are interested in engaging with us. Very quickly, just a quick update on COVID. We continue to see certainly cases in our schools, but it does appear that the numbers are decreasing, which is good news. We have test kits throughout our schools for those staff members or those families who cannot access a test kit. So please, if you don't have the ability to find a test kit or need one and your child is symptomatic, do not hesitate to contact your school's nurse. Generally speaking, it's actually been a little bit quiet, which is good news. So hopefully we're on a journey to a healthier space in the coming weeks. I think that's it for me. Again, a big thanks to the board and in cabinet and our administrative group that presented on Saturday. I'm actually really proud of the work that they've done and it really just incredibly thoughtful, caring group of teachers, leaders that I think Ridgefield Public Schools and everyone listening in should be proud of. Tonight, we will carry on with a list of questions and answers that we will be posting on the website, those questions that came from the board or anything that we may hear from the public. We will be sure to write down the question and answer it and then have that published on our district website for all to see. So we have a running document we'll share with you. I know there were some questions that the Board of Education asked for that we didn't have the answers for on Saturday necessarily, meaning reports or things like that, that will be linked into the document so that you'll have access to that actually at the end of tonight or first thing in the morning. And I think that really is it for me now, Jonathan.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva. Moving on to committee chairs, we will start with Ken with Budget, Finance, and Operations.
All right, so yes, so we did meet last week and we heard a thorough report from Ms. Dawn Norton. And I believe we were going to be discussing the financials and the transfers this evening.
Thank you, Ken. We also had a policy committee meeting this past week, Rachel.
Yes, we had our first policy committee of the year on 1/18, and we'll be bringing forward 5 policies later on this evening for the full board's consideration.
Thank you. Do we have any liaison reports to share this evening? Amy.
So it was my first meeting for the PTA, and I just want to say that I'm really honored to fill the position. And it was on January 14th. And I shared the important Board of Ed dates with them, and especially the dates regarding the budget process. I invited them to share their questions and concerns via email or at any of the Board of Ed meetings. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Amy. Other liaison reports, I saw Tina, you had your hand? Yes.
So I think in the last 2.5 weeks, I've attended the CABE Legislative Breakfast, the CES, and the RC CASA meeting. And I think the common theme, no matter what representative group I was part of or the meeting attended, I think the common themes were the fallout that COVID, we're seeing. Mental health seems to be a common theme. And also when we were at the CABE Legislative Breakfast, and Dr. De Silva can talk about this too a little bit, that almost the majority of the towns reported a sharp increase in the kids who are requiring services, mental health support. So I think that's the theme, no matter what meeting I attended as a large group: mental health, COVID, and children requiring services, and or either with mental health or something else. So I think that was kind of telling. And I know there's a special ed. I know Dr. Hanaway has a special ed report coming up. I think that'll be very interesting to hear too, because that's what I've heard in the last 3 weeks nonstop.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tina.
I would agree with Tina, and also at the CES Legislative Breakfast, which was several weeks before the most recent CABE breakfast. It was, again, same common themes. They could have written my budget presentation for me. Generally speaking, special education and the increase in the populations, and quite frankly, even with enrollment in the area, and how that diversified their population of students and the needs, mental health, and the impact of COVID and recovery efforts around that.
Thank you. Any other liaison reports? Okay, we can move on to approval of minutes, December 13th minutes. Do I have a motion?
I move that the Board of Education approve the minutes of December 13th, 2021.
Do I have a second? Sean, thank you. Anyone have any comments or adjustments to be made to these minutes? Rachel?
Jonathan, underneath correspondence to the board, part B, 2 corrections, please. So it says 1 submitted a request for a public comment. It should read 1 email regarding public comment. And then the next bullet down, instead of 1 email was about COVID-19 screening program, it should be 2 emails regarding the COVID-19 screening program. That's all.
Okay. Any other corrections? There being none, all those in favor of approving these minutes as amended, please raise your hands. And all those abstaining? All those opposed? Okay, unanimous, thank you all. Now we can move into the discussion items, starting with the special education presentation.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hanaway in a minute, but I imagine that some board members may be wondering why we're having another special education presentation after we had almost nearly an hour, Dr. Hanaway, on Saturday. And there's actually a reason. There's 2 reasons. In fact, I think that the primary reason that Dr. Hanaway is presenting tonight is on Saturday, we talked a lot about budget. And I think it's just as important to talk about budget within the context of the student and what trends we're seeing in special education, specifically here in Ridgefield programmatically. So I think that's an important piece that our Board of Education and the public need to hear, which is why you're going to hear again about special education. Yes, there's a significant impact on our budget, and I think it's important for everyone to understand contextually what this means for children and for our schools. Secondarily, we will actually be presenting, or Dr. Hanaway and her team will be presenting to the Board of Finance on February 15th. That presentation is actually not going to be much different than the presentation that everyone's going to hear this evening, but we do want to open that conversation up to the Board of Finance directly so that they can ask the questions that they are having when they're not obviously a part of these Board of Education meetings that we have every other week. So they're not quite as in tuned, I imagine, with what's happening with programs and the trends that we're seeing. So it's really, hopefully tonight will serve two purposes, give our Board of Education background before we present to the Board of Finance, but also let the Board of Finance listen in as they will prepare for their presentation on February 15th and identify all the questions and wonders that they might have as we look towards the Board of Finance in future weeks with respect to our budget. So now I'll tee it over to Dr. Hanaway and we'll get started.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, John. I am here welcoming with me tonight is Tony Shoa, who presented on Saturday with me on our budget. So to add to what Susie just said, we think that we recognize the requests that we've made to the Board of Ed and to the town as part of our budget. We think it's only fair to contextualize where that request comes from, and we gave you more information about our own population, but really what's happening across the state of Connecticut and what are the legal and fiscal parameters that we have to function within when we create a budget. We want to make sure that the community hears from us in terms of how these decisions get made and the trends that we've been seeing over the last number of years. Yes, COVID exacerbated, but really this has been growing well before COVID. So we'll be as efficient as we can this evening because we know there's other conversations after ours. But our purpose tonight, as I said, is to provide context for our budget requests that you heard on Saturday. We're going to touch upon tonight the legal requirements for providing appropriate services. What do we have to do? What has the evolution of special education been in Connecticut, not just in prevalence, but in the funding structures over the last 10 years? What other funding structures we function within that we touched upon briefly, and you'll see some repeated slides from Saturday. Those are just reminders. We will move through those quickly tonight because we know we showed them to you already. They're really teeing up for that conversation with the Board of Finance. We will give more context to the initial and ongoing impacts of COVID, and then we'll give some examples of breakdown of actual costs. Again, we mentioned some of these in brief on Saturday.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thanks for having us back. I'm going to jump into sort of an overview of the legal framework that drives most of what we do in special education, starting with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal anti-discrimination statute that we commonly call the IDEA for short, which identifies that every child, regardless of their special education status, has a right to what we call FAPE, which is free, appropriate public education. So what FAPE means is essentially that it's education that's at no cost to families, that it starts at the age of 3, is reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive education benefits, and is designed by their individualized education program team. So what that means is it could vary by student because it's designed individually by a team. And it also uses the team's measurements and analysis of the student's need to design that individualized education program. So notably, the designs of these services are intended to be dynamic, prepared to change if the student need or presentation changes, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the context of COVID a little later on. Okay, so a little bit more about that. Special education services are available to any and all eligible students between the ages of 3 and 22. So that eligibility, like I mentioned before, is determined by the planning and placement team, is what we call that design and evaluation team in the state of Connecticut. So the PPT designs eligibility based on some federal and state requirements and use evaluations in a team-based structure to determine eligibility and what the actual IEP design looks like. Okay, so if FAPE is sort of the beating heart of the IDEA, a key aspect of free appropriate public education is what we call LRE, or least restrictive environment. And so least restrictive environment basically means that the child should be educated as close to their non-disabled peers as possible in their home community with access to the general education setting and curriculum.
And I think what's the two big takeaways, I think, for the community on those last 2 slides are, one, while we design programs that most kids are appropriate for most kids, there's been a lot of best practice over time that tells us this kind of program meets most kids who have this type of profile. But at the end of the day, it's still individually designed on a case-by-case basis. So if we can't figure out the right fit in the constructs that we have to figure out the right construct for that student, and that is required by law, and that it's not one person's decision to do so. It has to be a group-based decision, a team-based decision based on all the information available. The second big takeaway on those slides is that it has to be dynamic. So you can't just assume if this is what the student gets now, this is what the student's always going to get, predictable programming, predictable costs. Not the case, as we all know, kids ebb and flow, and their definition of not only FAPE, but LRE is supposed to evolve over time. Okay, so I'm gonna give some context here in terms of prevalence facts in the state of Connecticut. So prevalence meaning just the population of students with disabilities in Connecticut. So the statewide enrollment for students, all public school students, not disability-based students, just all students, has declined more than 8% between 2007 and 2019. However, during this same time period, Connecticut's populations of students with disabilities grew by 23%. So right there, even if we don't have more students always per capita, just with the general ed population dropping overall, our prevalence rates increased just proportionately. And so then also during the same time period, statewide costs for special education grew by 1/3. Further, between 2010 and 2018, we saw huge increases within certain disability categories. A 74% increase in autism, a 42% increase in students having been identified with a health impairment, and a 37% increase in students identified with learning disability. Again, this is across the state of Connecticut. And then between 2000 and 2019, enrollment in out-of-district placement programs or private programs increased in Connecticut by 53%. So the trends that are, the long story short is the trends that we see in Connecticut, in Richfield, in Durgay, in Fairfield County, these are the same trends that we see across the entire state. So evolution as far as the cost of special education in Connecticut. So between 2007 and 16, statewide costs for special education programming grew by 21%. The average share of state contributions towards special education programs, and that's mostly through that, the excess cost reimbursement grant, but in other ways as well. But the average share of those state contributions towards local school districts decreased by 3%. So as the cost grew by 21% across the state, the contributions to local districts decreased by 3%. And then the tuition expenditures for those private programs during that same time period increased by almost 40%. So the math just doesn't add up in terms of keeping up with not only the prevalence rates, but the year-over-year increase in cost. And then between 2008 and 2019, the percentage of excess cost reimbursements back to districts decreased from 100%. So we were getting whatever we claimed over 4.5 times per pupil. If we spent $50,000 more than that, we were getting $50,000 back. That dropped from a 100% reimbursement rate to a 72% reimbursement rate over that 11-year period of time. The initial drop, no doubt, was a response to the economic recession in 2008. But then this did not normalize or bounce back the way the economy did a number of years later. We've continued to decrease. So this is a breakdown of how is special education paid for in Connecticut. And so what you see here is that 65% of the costs come from local. This is on average, but 60, and this runs generally true within Richfield, but 65% comes from the local municipality, 29% from state funding, and 6% from federal government.
Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more about those pie wedges and how these funding mechanisms are designed. So first of all, like I mentioned before, the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is not only an anti-discrimination law, it's also a federal funding statute. And then we'll talk about the Connecticut-based excess cost reimbursement grant. So first of all, the IDEA like I mentioned, is a grant statute that provides federal funding for the education of children with disabilities ages 3 to 22. And that's intended to supplement local efforts. As Dr. Hanway showed in a couple of slides ago, there's a bit of a Pac-Man dynamic there with local being the lion's share and then being supplemented by federal and state in a smaller proportion. So the IDA does require, as a condition of the receipt of these funds, that states agree to provide FAPE, free appropriate public education, to every eligible child. As I mentioned earlier, that eligibility is designed by the PPT. And additionally, each local education agency or district must maintain its effort through the state and local expenditures on special education. So to me, that's a tacit acknowledgement that our prevalence rates are always going to go up, right? Because the federal law says that you have to keep spending the same amount or more. And so that's basically them saying you're going to see more and more students with disabilities over time. Our most recent IDA grant allocation was about $941,000, which is only about 6% of our special education budget. This has the IDA grant has a 2-year carryover structure based on an annual allocation, which ensures that its base year funding, which was way back in 1999, authorizes additional monies based on that first year and gives additional monies based on the total number of students in the state that are identified with disability.
So you can
catching up with my notes.
Go ahead.
All right, so you can see from the table that there's been roughly a 3% increase in our IDEA grant allocation between 2019 and 2022. So roughly keeping pace with our prevalence rate, however, still a very small proportion of our overall funding. Again, the grant is designed to supplement, not supplant, but as our need grows, so does our dependence on staffing. So you can see the largest piece of that pie there is certified staff. From this slide, I want to offer a quick shout out to Kathy and Patty, Kathy Carnaz and Patty McCarthy, who are so diligent in tracking our grants budgets, but also in collecting, verifying, reporting on volumes of federal and state reporting data for our compliance mandate. So kudos to them for tracking all of this for us. And then Liz, I think you wanted to make a comment about the pie chart.
Yeah, so I think it's notable that the grant, over 90% of the grant goes towards staffing. So that has been the design of the grant in Ridgefield for as far back as I can find records of the grant, which predates, me and Tony in the 18-19 school year. However, that is pretty consistent across districts, at least from my, not extensive, but somewhat relative observation, is that the vast majority of grant monies is spent because there is some level of reliability in how much you're going to get, a pretty good level of reliability. You just know that you're not going to increase that much. So reason why this is so relevant is we will get questions from the community a lot to say, well, why don't you use your IDEA grant? Well, the reality is the IDEA grant is very much tied up right now already. So the other grant is a state grant called excess cost. We touched on this on Saturday. And essentially, this is a reimbursement designed grant for when the district spends over 4.5 times their per pupil expenditure for a student with an IEP. So our per pupil 4.5 times expenditure for this coming year is $97,596. So this means that we have to spend over this amount prior to receiving reimbursement. And I think it's important to note that there's a double-edged sword to the excess cost reimbursement grant, because every time our per pupil goes up, as does the grant, except it doesn't go up proportionately. So if our per pupil goes up by $1,000, we have to then spend $4,500 in order to meet the previous threshold that we would have for that student. So again, the state reimbursed at a percentage, which is not at 100% rate. We do not know what the percentage of reimbursement will be for this coming year yet. And we did reduce the amount in our overall budget this year from 1.4 million in reimbursement expected to 1.3 because the threshold is just growing at such a, it's an exponential rate. It's a 4.5 times. At a certain point, it's really hard to keep up with, even with the fast growing costs within special education. So this is a lot of numbers. I'm going to cut to the chase in terms of describing what it says. So the third column from the right is the total amount that we received. And you see here a consistent drop in the amount the district has gotten back. Meanwhile, the threshold has had the converse pattern. So the more the threshold goes up, the less that we've gotten back. Last year, we had a significant decrease, and that was due to we couldn't charge a lot of out-of-district transportation to excess costs because a lot of students were remote. So that was a huge windfall of COVID. The state realized that districts were going to take that hit, so they increased the reimbursement rate to 83% to help us out a little bit. But they said to us, be clear, this is a one-time deal. It's not going to be 83% in coming years. So just between, if you look at the jumps in the last 4 years, 82 to 87 to 92 to 97, it's becoming really difficult to rely on the excess cost grant. And this is the number of students who met excess cost in previous years and into this year, and the number of students is dropping. And just to add to additional context, we have another 13 students who are right within $12,000 of meeting that threshold, who will not meet the threshold, at least as of right now, for our first filing. So we track students within tens of thousands of dollars of the threshold, just in case something changes in their program. And if we can't claim them in the December filing, we can claim them in the March. It's something that is in a week-to-week effort in our office. We keep incredibly diligent records so that we can maximize the benefit of reimbursement.
All right, then the slide that Tina foreshadowed, the COVID effect, right? So the pandemic added further, and I would say unprecedented complication to our students with disabilities, and thus the need to provide FAPE in a flexible way, like we mentioned before. We've experienced an influx of students in the form of new referrals. So students that were in district that were referred to special education in greater numbers than we experienced before, and also students who already had IEPs moving into district from other states and other districts in Connecticut as well. The districts has applied to short-term congressional authorization grants like the American Rescue Plan and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. So you can see that we did get some monies for those, but those are intended to alleviate short-term some of the immediate effects of COVID. I think what we can't anticipate fully here, other than just saying our prevalence numbers will go up, the complexity of services will go up. I think it's plain to see that we're experiencing quite a burst of it right now, but it's very difficult to see 1, 2, or 5 years into the future of what may come, based on the fact that we educate kids for about 19 years under federal law. So we might be looking at this for the long term, but at least in the immediate, we've got about $400,000 from these limited time grants. And again, if you recall from the chart that we showed at the budget meeting the other night, it's a reminder of our prevalence rate. You'll notice if you go back to our budget presentation that all of our Durgay peers are on a growth trend. The Durgay average, actually, if you look at all these towns or districts put together, it's about a 13.9% average for the 2021 school year. So we fall sort of right between the state average and the Durgay average. So we're sort of squarely there, but still on a growth rate. And there's, I don't think from any Durgay peer or within Ridgefield or even nationally, there's been any sort of stagnation or reduction in prevalence.
So we mentioned this on Saturday, that including transportation, so including in-town and out-of-town special transportation, our budget, special education represents 16% of the superintendent's proposed budget. The average across our neighbors, at least within Durgay, is that their special education budgets represent 20 to 25%. And that's, that's been from that's not me and Tony this year, last year, the year before. That's been an ongoing effort, at least as far as we can tell, at least over the last 8 years in the district to try to be as fiscally responsible as possible. And then the last thing we will show is we get a lot of questions sometimes on like the reality of costs. Like sometimes we'll say questions like, you say things are really expensive or it costs a lot. Like, what does that mean? And so here are some examples of breakdowns of costs. Public out of district tuition. So that would be at one of our regional education support centers like EdAdvance or CES, or in rare cases further than that, is about average is about $70,000 a student. Private out of town district or out of district tuition on average is about $85,000 a year. Shared transportation vehicle out of town per student, I should note theirs per student is about $18,000. And then an individual, this is on average, individual transportation vehicle out of town per student is $70,000. And then as an example, a private neuropsychological or psychiatric evaluation is about $6,000. So this is in a lot of cases, some of these are predictable costs. We see students, months down the line, sometimes even a school year down the line, maybe needing something. But in a lot of cases, these are things that may happen within the same school year. So we do our best to predict an ebb and flow, students needing these types of services and students coming back. I mentioned in our budget presentation, we brought 6 students back into district this school year, which is a great year for that type of statistic. But we do our best to try to predict the ebb and flow. And with that, we will take questions. Again, this is really us to provide more context to how the budget gets developed and what are the parameters that we have to function within in doing so.
Thank you, Dr. Hanaway. Thank you, Dr. Shoa.
Thank you for providing that overview. Do we have questions from board members on these numbers, on this information? Tina, your hand is almost up.
I just wanted to say thank you. I think it's so important that we keep sharing this because, when people or community as a large listens to this, they forget that when we talk about RPS, we're talking about all kids, and that means the differently abled and how that looks in budget numbers. I think that's the part we all forget. And there's really one big bucket. Yes, of course, we present in different cost centers, but I think this is really important because it helps the community by and large to understand that how we have to provide education for all the kids, and we're trying to do the best and right, ethically, whatever, every possible way for all these kids. So I just thank you. I think it's so important we understand how this works. Again, bears repeating what the grants do, how much we get or we don't get. I just think it was great. So thank you for all that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is the community's obligation to provide this sort of education, not just for the easy or inexpensive students to educate, but for all 4,500 students in our district. Other questions? Dr. Silva, do you have your hand up?
I don't.
Okay.
I've listened to this a lot.
Okay.
Not allowed, no.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate that overview. I'm sure it'll be helpful for the Board of Finance as well. Next up, we have a presentation on elementary math curriculum resource collaborative action.
All right. So before we get started with our team that's here to present, led by Ms. Gillette, when I think back to my entry plan just about 1.5 years ago, one of the topics outside of early literacy was mathematics at the elementary level, and a great deal of concern that I heard from the community about, first of all, an assured experience, what was happening across our 6 schools and was it consistent? What was the primary resource that we were using in our elementary schools? How did we articulate that, the teaching of mathematics to our families? And as a result of that, and once we had an elementary director on board, Ms. Johnson, that was certainly the feedback that I gave her, but then through her own study, and certainly her partnership with her elementary principals, we came to the conclusion that we needed to take this into a collaborative action team that most of you are familiar with, because that's the process that we use to develop or to implement our phonemic awareness program. It's also the process that we use to identify, or the process that we're using to identify our phonics program. And here we are with mathematics. And so as much as possible, we did want to present to the Board of Education, to the community, before we presented the superintendent's budget on items that were in the budget. That said, that's not always easy to do when you only have a short 3 or 4 months before you're preparing your budget. And so while this is slightly out of order, we presented to you on Saturday and here we are tonight. I think the timing is good enough for the board and the public to understand why this is an important piece of the superintendent's proposed budget, and something that I feel really strongly about, not only because it's early numeracy is a key component to any elementary program, but it's something that we've heard loud and clear from our community that is necessary in our schools. So our team, as they have done with every other curriculum initiative that they've brought to you, they're thoughtful, there's a process, they're not just buying for the sake of buying and implementing for the sake of implementing, but far, far deeper. And hopefully you'll see that tonight in the presentation from the team. So now I'll transition that over to Corey, as she'll lead the group in the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva. And I just want to give a special thank you, as we're about to present to you tonight, to our building leaders, our elementary principals who are with us. It has been shown time and time again in research that success comes in schools when principals are the instructional leaders. And we have tonight examples of that here, but we have that in Ridgefield Public Schools in all our buildings. So we're lucky to have that. So before we begin our presentation on mathematics, I want to give this team an opportunity to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Karen. I'm the principal at Farmingville Elementary.
Good evening. I'm Jill Katkosen. I'm the principal at Scotland Elementary.
Good evening. I'm Keith Margolis, principal at Branchville Elementary.
Good evening, everyone. It's Linda Johnson, Director of Elementary Education.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Corbishley, the 612 Math Science Supervisor.
Great. John, can you put up our slides, please? Great. So here we are again talking to you about another CAT, another collaborative action team. So the purpose of our presentation tonight is to take you through the process that we are going through as a team, really a K-12 team, to select a new curriculum resource for our elementary mathematics program. But before we do that, we're going to make sure that you have some context for the conversation. And we're going to talk to you about the K-12 RPS comprehensive approach to mathematics, so that you can see how the work that this team is doing on this elementary mathematics curriculum resource fits into the greater K-12 context of mathematics instruction in Ridgefield Public Schools. And then, of course, we'll be happy to take any questions. So we're back on this slide again, which I think you're going to get tired of soon, because you saw it on Saturday and you've seen it in previous conversations when we've talked about the difference between a curriculum resource and a curriculum. So this collaborative action team, yet again, another one, is looking to see what curriculum resource that we can select in our elementary schools that will best support the curriculum that has already been established for mathematics. So the result of this collaborative action team will not change the curriculum. It will instead provide teachers, all elementary teachers, with one assured resource that they'll all be using that is up to date and supports their day-to-day instruction in mathematics. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Linda Johnson, who's going to take it away from here.
Thank you, Corey. And again, good evening, everyone. So the first part of our presentation will focus on how students learn concepts, skills, and strategies to be successful mathematicians. Jeff and I are going to briefly talk about the components of our comprehensive approach to teaching and learning math K through 12. That continues to represent the work of our math department. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a graphic that represents what we value as a district in terms of teaching and learning math in all of our grades, kindergarten through 12th grade. Our curriculum is aligned to the Common Core state standards and practices for mathematics. Our instructional and assessment practices are linked to the 3 elements of rigor that you see here on this slide: conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and real-life application. We value these 3 components along with the 8 mathematical practices equally. I'm going to speak very briefly about each one of these. So conceptual understanding refers to the comprehension of mathematical concepts, operations, and relations. It stresses the importance of understanding what the concepts mean and the importance of learning it. So in other words, the why or the purpose for learning, which is incredibly valuable regardless of the grade level in our schools. Procedural fluency relates to the skills in carrying out procedures flexibly, accurately, efficiently, and appropriately. We know that when students are accurate, they are able to find the correct answer. When our students are efficient, they can solve a problem with a strategy that saves time or labor. And when students are flexible, they know multiple strategies and they can choose one to solve a particular problem. And the third element is the application to real life situations, or what you may often hear people refer to as problem solving. And this is when students apply their conceptual understanding and procedural fluencies to solve problems by applying their reasoning skills, critical thinking skills, and collaboration skills. And of course, the arrow that you see represents assessment, which is another important part of our programming. And we do make sure that we are monitoring our students' success, their strengths, their challenges, and we do that through a variety of assessments, whether it's curriculum-based or standardized. And next, Jeff is going to talk about the 8 mathematical practices.
So thanks, Linda. So this comprehensive mathematics approach embeds our 8 mathematical practices across all grade levels, K-12. So we really want to think that these are the practices students engage in as they make sense, develop possible solution paths, use different tools and mathematical representations to explore and communicate the mathematics they're learning. So this graphic is a really nice way to think about the practices, because practice standards 1 and 6, which are vertically, can be viewed as those habits of mind of a productive mathematical thinker. So you can think of those as the larger umbrella. And then underneath that, we have these different categories. They include our development of mathematical reasoning explanation. It includes mathematical modeling, again, using those tools. And finally, seeing structure for the purpose of generalizing to larger mathematical truths and understandings. All of these practices are used from K-12, and students develop them and grow throughout our progression. So you can think of these standards as a through line between all our grading course curricula in mathematics and the foundation of our instruction, our assessment, and professional learning that we engage in. These standards are reflected in our curriculum as well as our curricular resources. So all the students in RPS really do have a consistent approach to learning mathematics. So now Linda's really going to discuss how this comprehensive approach is at the heart of our process of researching and adopting a mathematics curriculum resource.
Okay, so the next part of our presentation focuses on the process we are following to reach a decision about adopting and then eventually implementing a new systematic research-based curriculum resource to support our students in their learning of math. This year, as part of our district priorities, we have a process in place that you've heard about in terms of how we've pulled a team of teachers together along with administrators to study, research, and then make a recommendation to adopting a new resource. Next slide, please. So what you see here, and again, this might look a little familiar to you. You've seen something very similar to it when we presented on phonics and phonemic awareness. The inner circle or the inner part here represents the use of that curriculum resource in any content area in grades K through 12. And it really is the heart to teaching the essential components that Jeff and I just spoke about. Currently, the primary resource we have been relying on at the elementary level to teach grade level expectations is Math and Focus, the 2013 edition. Some of the resources from this edition are not aligned to our curriculum or are no longer available in print or digital form. As a result, to some degree, we've been using other resources, for example, Math and Practice, Exemplars, Dreambox, to supplement instruction. And as a team, we identified the need to adopt and implement a new resource to bring greater consistency and coherence in how our students learn across the 6 elementary schools. Next slide. So next, our principals will talk about the process we have established to do this work. Again, this might look familiar to you. It's very similar to the process that we put in place for studying our phonics resource. And we did this intentionally because we believe that this is an effective way to form a collaborative team with short-term goals. And here's Keith Margolis, who's going to talk about the team we have in place.
Thanks, Linda. I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about the structure of the Math Collaborative Action Team, or MathCat for short. This fall, a MathCat was formed with a clear purpose. The purpose was to study, explore, and eventually recommend a research-based math resource that is aligned to the comprehensive approach that Linda and Jeff just spoke about. So what you see here are the guiding principles that our team is following, and we'll talk a little bit more about this evening. The structure and process we're following come from a well-known educational leader. His name is Rick DeFore, who has done work with how to develop collaborative action teams or collaborative teams. So right here, our MathCat team includes representatives from all 6 elementary schools, general and special education teachers, pre-K-5, administrators from the elementary and secondary levels. And I want to highlight that for a moment. We thought it was important to gain the perspective of our middle and high school colleagues and to learn how a decision we will make eventually, how that decision interfaces with the program and approach of the middle school. And in fact, in large part, that's Jeff's role here. And of course, our math specialists from the elementary and middle school levels are also members of the team. Designated times are scheduled for the meetings with a clear purpose and process for working together. For example, we meet as a grade level, or the grade level team meets, reviews the new information, talks about the research-based practices we've seen in the programs. As well, we gain feedback from those team members and shared experiences. You may be wondering, okay, so how do we then communicate that to the larger teacher body? And we have a system in place for that. Our part of the role of a member is to turn back to grade levels and provide that information, but we also have a Google Classroom where information is posted and can be easily accessed to learn about the work of the CAT. So that's an overview, a bit of the structure. Jill's going to now talk specifically about the process the MathCat is using.
Thank you, Keith. So the process in which the MathCat is undergoing is to study and make recommendations for a new math primary resource. The first part of the process has focused on studying 3 curriculum resources. We have been looking at Math and Focus, the 2020 edition, Methodology, and Bridges Mathematics. Nancy will discuss these resources a little bit deeper in just a few minutes. This year, the MathCat participated in overview presentations to learn about each of these resources. The team met with staff developers from each company who presented information about their research-aligned approaches systematic scope and sequence that's aligned with the Common Core, teaching and assessment resources, and student practice activities and materials. MathCat members then had the opportunity to review both print and digital resources. As we review these materials, we're keeping in mind the transition from elementary to middle school and how each of these resources would support students with this transition. After attending presentations, team members complete a feedback form that targets these important elements of each program. That feedback will be discussed at a subsequent team meeting and will be referred to when making recommendations. Another part of the process involves collaborating with neighboring districts that are currently using one of these curriculum resources. Meeting times have been scheduled to talk with teachers and administrators about their experiences with the adoption, implementation, professional learning, and other suggestions. The second part of the process includes the team making a recommendation regarding the adoption of a new curriculum resource. After reviewing feedback from the MathCat, the team will also make a recommendation about an implementation plan. You will hear more about this when we talk about next steps. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Nancy, who will share more about the curriculum resources that we've been studying.
Thank you so much, Jill. So as you can see, and as Jill mentioned, we chose these three curriculum resources to study. And the reason we chose these three specifically is because they are aligned to our curriculum and the comprehensive approach that Linda spoke about earlier. Each of these follows a systematic scope and sequence. They build upon the child's understanding. They have highly effective research-based frameworks, and they really help our students to progress through the mathematical Common Core standards and embed those 8 mathematical practices that Jeff spoke about. All three of these programs also include the concrete pictorial or representational, sometimes this is referred to as CRA, sometimes CPA, but the concrete pictorial abstract practice. So basically what that means is our students are starting by working with concrete materials, then they move on to looking at it in an abstract way, drawing pictures, and then eventually they're able to think of it in a more abstract way. So 2 of these, Math in Focus and Methodology, really rely on Singapore math. And we've been using Singapore math in the district for many years. Some things you may hear when you're hearing about Singapore math is the metacognition, which refers to students thinking about their own thinking, mathematical problem solving, and really, again, this is continuing the work that our kids have been doing with the Math in Focus 2013 edition that we're using now. So it's important to note that methodology actually has 2 programs. One is called Developing Roots, and Developing Roots is specific to kindergarten students, helping them learn their early numeracy skills. And Think Mathematics would be implemented in grades 1 through 5. Bridges Mathematics is unique in that we are already using the Bridges Intervention Program with our students who are in the MTSS process. So our math specialists are familiar with this companion product. Bridges, just like Math in Focus and Methodology, also really helps kids to talk about math, to solve complex problems, and to think about their thinking in mathematics. I think we're ready for the next slide, please, John. This slide tells us just a little bit about other districts in our DIRG and what programs they're using. And you can see that quite a few districts are using Math in Focus, but it's important to note they're all using different editions. Some may be using 2013 as we are. There's a 2017 edition as well as the 2020 edition. We know that Farmington is currently adopting methodology for the next school year. And we understand that Wilton and Weston are also looking at it. While you don't see Bridges in any of these districts, there are a lot of local districts that are using it, such as Bethel, Newtown, Region 15, and Fairfield. And now I'm going to pass this back to my colleague, Linda, who will talk about our next steps.
Thanks, everyone. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen next. We still have a little study left to do. We're going to continue to review the print and digital sample materials that we have in district. As mentioned, we do plan to collaborate with some colleagues in neighboring districts where we can gain some understanding about why they chose the resource that they did to adopt, and then also learn a little bit about their implementation process and how it's been going. We will also continue to meet as a collaborative team, collect that feedback so that we can eventually make the recommendation to our superintendent, share that with all of you sometime before the end of this school year. Our recommendation will include which resource we would like to adopt, a timeline for that implementation, which would begin next school year. The implementation plan will include which grade levels we would recommend for implementing in for the fall of 2022. And we are keeping in mind that there will be a new resource for teaching phonics in our primary grades. So our team is looking closely at implementing this math resource in grades 3 through 5. The implementation plan will also include recommendations for professional learning. And as you heard on Saturday at the budget meeting, the plan is connected to a proposed budget cost in a couple of ways. We included a proposed cost for teacher and student resource materials, as well as professional learning. And as you know, we also requested a district-wide math coach for various reasons in terms of professional learning, supporting our teachers in many areas, but also in terms of supporting the implementation of this resource. And thank you, everyone, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, team.
Thank you for taking us through the process that we're all going through. I'm sure there are going to be questions from the board. Who would like to start us off? I just had a quick question on some of the other resources being used in other districts that were not mentioned. It was Region 9 and New Canaan had others. Did they not meet the criteria that you had set out at the beginning to assess?
Linda, do you want to answer that?
So Jonathan, I just want to make sure I understand your question.
I was just curious. There were 2 resources being used by 2 other districts that were not part of this study. I was wondering if they were left off for a particular reason.
Not necessarily a particular reason, but our team did want to consider staying with a resource that was aligned to the tenets of Singapore math that Nancy spoke about earlier. Our district has invested, as you may be aware, quite a bit of time, energy, efforts into professional learning around how to teach a spiraling approach. What Singapore math, the way that they approach their curriculum is called a spiral approach that is grounded in Jerome Bruner's research. And because of the efforts that our district has put into some of that work, we did look at resources that were similar to, like, for example, Bridges does some of that work, does work with the concrete pictorial abstract, again, that Nancy spoke about. We wanted to stay closer to those resources. We also were looking at what was well aligned to the Common Core state standards. And if they were not directly aligned, what those pathways would look like and the work that we would need to do with them. But I will say that I'm familiar with the 2 other resources that are on that list. They're solid resources. I've used some of them myself in the past, either as a teacher or as a district leader. And I'm sure that they're meeting the needs of the district and the students in them.
Just the one, if I can add, Jonathan, is what's challenging about, and I think the Corey set it up well, the distinguishing difference between a curriculum and a resource is there isn't a one size fits all resource, as much as people might think that there is. And sometimes people can get confused with the book is their curriculum, which is, obviously not. But it is difficult for any team to look at one resource as being perfect or meeting the needs of our students, our community, and certainly the Common Core state standards. And I'm sorry, I know you were calling on Amy, Jonathan, but just wanted to add that piece.
Thanks. Amy, you have a question?
Yes, I'm just wondering, no matter which resource you end up choosing, will you still use things like Dreambox that you're using now? And I'm just wondering, in case you're not, how that affects our subscription, if we're paying a long-term fee for that, or just wondering about that sort of stuff.
Sure, I can grab that one, Corey. Is that okay with you? Yep. Okay. So what we do need to keep in mind is that we're most likely going to have that staggered implementation approach. So next year, let's say, for example, that we decide to implement in grades 3 through 5. We're still going to need those supplemental resources for K through 2 to support the teaching and learning of math in our primary grades. And then depending on the resource that we do select, that will help us determine what we may or may not need to continue. We did plan for those supplemental resources to still be in place for next year, for at least K2, and then some of the resources will still be available for K5.
Just if I could elaborate on that a minute. So as an example, Amy, let's just say that they selected math and focus, and I don't know this 100% to be true, but the digital resource there may not be adaptive. Dreambox, for example, is. So given the fact that let's just say one digital resource or one digital support for kids that might want to work independently is not adaptive, that may not fulfill that need completely. And that is, again, the challenge with any particular resource. It may not fulfill every gap. So you want to look at everything that it brings to the table and then make your decisions thereafter. And we've had lots of dialogue around the digital resources that we do currently have and whether or not we can begin eliminating them once, let's just say that we have a K-5 math program in place. And that's still, that very well may be an option, but we have to be careful of when we do that. And I can say for sure, with 100% certainty, oftentimes the success of the implementation or the success of a new mathematics resource or the failure of is always based on the implementation, not the resource itself. Most of the time, school districts, whether it's perfect or exactly what they wanted, maybe yes, maybe no, but where it falls apart is implementation. And that's in math, that's in reading, that's in anything that we do. And so the carefulness, I heard Linda say it, and I know that she's being cautious because there is a team in place for this reason. But when she, for example, suggested that the implementation in grades 3-5 rather than K2, there may be a lot of questions around why would you do that? Why wouldn't you start with the primary grades, right? While at the same time thinking about what the primary grade teachers are going to be implementing next year, which is phonemic awareness and a new phonics program. How much professional development? What does that mean in terms of time in the classroom or time away from kids to access professional learning? So all of those things come in play in terms of that implementation plan. And so every piece and every decision making, it has to be really thoughtfully decided upon, because at the end of the day, that's where this all can fall apart. So for every bit of money that we spend, we're very thoughtful about how that gets designed in our classrooms.
And I'll just add on to what you're saying, Dr. De Silva, is that making a recommendation and then adopting, implementing a resource, those are the very first steps to success. The team is going to stay together. There's still some really big heavy lifts once we decide which resource we're going to put into our classrooms, right? Like we will continue to look at the scope and sequence critically. We will unpack each unit with our teachers. We'll look at the assessments and make sure they are aligned to what we're teaching and what we want to know about our learners. Professional learning will continue. It's not a stop go. And in our line of business, right, we're continuously growing and learning. And that professional learning is going to vary depending on the teacher's needs, what we're seeing from our students. So this is, the first step of many steps to continuing the good work that's been in our school district for teaching mathematics. And I'm super excited to be working with the group to do the work.
The power of this type of work as well, and you see Jeff here on the call, and I know that they've had representatives from the secondary level as part of the team, is that ability to see K-12. Because if you're going to have a program, let's just throw out math and focus or bridges or anything else, and it's not aligned or not connected to the secondary level work, again, just a failure in terms of its process and structure. And I think that is another key, if not one of the more important keys to the successful implementation of a new mathematics primary resource. And again, those of us that have some gray hair on our heads have seen many of good primary resources not work well in school districts. I mean, Singapore Math or primary mathematics or Math in Focus, whatever you want to call it, depending upon your edition, is one of those particular situations where some school districts adopted them, but did not provide teachers with the appropriate professional learning. And that in of itself fell apart. And then parents were confused, and there were multiple layers to why that didn't go well. But yet you had perhaps a great resource that would have met the community's needs. But because of that process, unfortunately, it ended up failing. And so I know that I have full confidence in the team and the process in which they're going through to make sure that every step that they've taken has been carefully considered.
Thank you. Tina, you have a question?
Just a comment, and I'm going to borrow something that Sean has said a million times. I've been part of this math conversation. I have a sophomore now, and we've talked about math consistently, constantly. We've always talked about, but it was always like silos. There was elementary, and then there was middle school, and then there was high school, and it never lined up. So I think it's great that we're having these conversations. It's so great that Jeff is part of this conversation, because in the end, all the math that the kids learn or whatever, it does go to middle school, it does go to high school. And if their base is off, or their strength, or if they're not taught the proper structure at the lowest levels, it just, you somehow turn off kids or whatever it be, because kids learn differently. You lose those kids, or you don't develop them enough. So I think it's just great that we're having these conversations now, because trust me, I've listened to this, and he's a sophomore now, and it's been since first grade. So it's just so great. And I know, Sean, you've said this, I'm glad we're having these conversations. I just had a quick question, and it's only because we were talking about special ed before this. The resource that we're looking in, is it adaptive enough? Is it for all kids? That includes the special ed kids too? Does that make sense? It's for all kids. It works for all kids.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Linda.
So you've heard us say that the 3 resources that we were looking at are researched aligned. So what that means is that we've looked at numerous studies of the best ways to teach mathematics, whether you have an IEP or you don't have an IEP. And that's been part of our criteria when we look at the materials, print, digital. You heard Jeff, or I think it was actually Keith, say we have members from our special education department on our team. So we gain their insights. And we do plan to include all of our teachers, general education and special education teachers, in the professional learning process, so that they will learn alongside our classroom teachers, our administrators, myself. And that's where we can make those decisions, what might need to be modified, what might need to be adjusted, adapted for students with an IEP, or quite frankly, a student without an IEP. And that's where we have taken a very close look at the differentiated instruction component to these resources. What kind of DI is there for students who might be struggling with learning a mathematical concept, or a student who's picking it up, easy peasy? And then where's that enrichment piece for that type of student or that learner?
And if I could just add, the vast majority of our students with IEPs are participating alongside their general ed peers with the same curriculum and content.
They always say they're general.
It's a rarity that they need a separate program. It exists, of course, but typically it's not in the content. Often it's in the what we call the teaching moves that needs to be maybe presented differently or accommodated in some way. So everything that Linda said, I definitely would echo.
Thank you. Just great to hear. And I love the enrichment part too, because you're right. There are some kids who just pick up, but there's something, they're always there. So that everybody's always learning together. Thank you. It's great. Great to hear this. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Thank you very much for providing this overview. It is really quite something to see the process that you're going through. It feels like everybody's on the right page here. Thank you.
Thank you, team.
Thank you, team. Thanks for coming out. Thank you.
Okay, next up is the superintendent's 2022-2023 proposed budget discussion. Now, last year and this year, we did something a little bit different in the meetings coming up to tonight. We've done the full day Saturday workshop. In years past, that was spread out over many nights, over a few weeks leading up to tonight. And what I mean by tonight is this is the night before our next meeting where we actually vote on the budget. So this is the night where we should be bringing all of our questions line item by line item, whatever we need clarification on, whatever we want to push back on, this is the night to do it. We will, of course, have more time next meeting before we take a vote, and we will have time in between to send emails with questions to prep the team for next meeting. But we're going to go through the whole budget piece by piece. I'm going to make sure that we touch on every addition as it was proposed, and we'll go through hopefully. Please raise your hands or jump in whenever you do have a question, but I'm going to take us through the book, starting with elementary schools. Elementary schools. My first question on the staffing. It says that we're up to budget to budget, but what is that actual to budget?
Jonathan, you said we were up to.
We're moving on classroom teachers on elementary from 101 to 103, but that's budgeted 2021-2 versus budgeted 22-3. So I believe we've already made those adds. Is that correct?
Susie, would you like me to answer that?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so you're right, Jonathan, what you're seeing is budget to budget. So last year we had budgeted 101 elementary teachers, and for next year we're budgeting 103. We actually needed 103 this year. So we went up over 2 FTE post budget this summer, and we will remain that way through projections for FY23. So one was budget to budget, and then our actuals to budget are going to be the same.
Thank you.
Jonathan, just structurally, if you can for 1 second, we're going to, we have our notes from Saturday. So we're going to add another column with each cost center. We already have that prepared where we'll type in the questions and answers as well. We have some follow-ups that we've already answered. I believe that Ms. Flogel asked for some further data on the technology resources. Ms. Flogel, we've linked that resource into the document. So I think for, I'm just trying to think structurally, if you'd like us to share that with the board tonight as we continue to move forward, or you want us to send it after tonight. You tell me.
My perspective is you can send it afterwards. It was a curiosity point on expirations, and it actually went to Amy's question earlier about, are we buying things we're not going to be able to get out of the licensing structure for? And I also think the Board of Finance probably just needs to know if we're making multi-year agreements that are operating expense, that it makes sense to do it. I support that. I just think we need to be transparent about it.
Sure. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll continue to just write down all the questions from this evening. Even those questions, by the way, that we answered on Saturday, we included them in the Q&A just because I think the community might find that a little bit easier if they're looking at questions around each cost center and just seeing how they were answered in one document, if they prefer not to watch the video. And then Jonathan, just as so I can follow along, you're starting off with the elementaries and working all the way through the book.
That was my plan, just to keep it easy. Everybody's got the same book. Everybody can flip through at the same time. I won't have all the questions, of course, but that was just one that was top of mind on that first page. The other two items on that first page are the math coach and the 1.4 supervisors. Do we have questions from the board? They were both addressed on Saturday. Do we have questions from the board or comments? I know, Liz, you had questions about the supervisory positions.
Yeah, less than questions, just more commentary. I mean, look, my line by line, I kind of said it on Saturday, but I'll just reiterate, our enrollment is down 8% over the last couple of years, just like the state is. And while I recognize that we do have other considerations there, our admin costs, take out special ed, our admin costs continue to rise even with declining enrollment. And so we just need to be really conscientious that, over 10 years, we're 12% down, but our budget continues to rise. And over 5 years, we're 8% down. So our overall population is declining, but our budget continues to rise. And so this is more trending that I'm looking at, and those administrative roles. And I know we've talked about them being in classroom versus administrator. They truly are not classroom teachers. So in my mind, that's an administrative role. So we just need to be really conscientious and explain that to the community why their taxes need to be raised despite declining enrollment consistently.
Thanks. Any other questions on or comments on the addition of the math? Oh, Selena?
That number was 8%. Our enrollment's down 8%. Did I hear that right? In how many years?
Yeah, over the last 5 years, we're down 8%.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just really
No. I was just looking at the enrollment reports. We're down 8% over 5 years.
I'm just like having trouble following everything and trying to write down everything.
Welcome to the first budget season.
And thanks for that, Liz. I appreciate you having those numbers. Actually,
yeah, no worries. I just you don't have this book probably yet, but we'll get it. We'll get you one. That's helpful.
Questions on elementary staffing? Do you want to look at the elementary budget numbers with me? We're looking at a 6.7% increase overall. The vast majority of that is the addition of the math and the supervisor positions. Any other questions at the line item level on the elementary all budget? No. I was planning to skip the individual elementary schools unless anybody had a line item question at any one of the locations. Please.
I just had one. I noticed that, and I apologize because I didn't go line by line. I just looked at the bottom line. Ridgeberry is up double from the other. It looks like double from the other elementary schools. Is there anything specific that calls out why?
Liz, can you double and where and what spot?
I'm looking at the end of the report grand total at the percent change of 3% for Ridgeberry versus, and I just flipped through quickly for Barlow and VP and Scotland, and they were all at 1% plus, under 2%.
Yeah, if I'm looking at it here, let me just take a quick look. It seems to vary. So for example, the teacher line at Ridgeberry, for example, is up 2.67% versus Scotland 1.76, and it just may be the teachers and where they are on the salary schedule.
Okay, thank you.
They did, the elementary principals did, sorry, Jonathan, they did use this year, as did the middle schools actually. We went to a more formula-based model in terms of their allocations for instructional materials and resources. So that's why they're closer. So if you happen to see that small difference, it's likely because of where they are and what their teachers are in the salary and the contractual obligations for them.
Got it, makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Any other line item questions on any of the elementary locations? Ken.
And that would be the same thing for Farmingville. So following up on Liz's point, that bottom line went up 5.6%.
So it's a couple of different things. They use the enrollment in the formula. And if I look at Farmingville, there was some occasions where I think in Farmingville in particular, if I remember correctly, there was a particular area that they were in need of picking up resources. I want to say it was in the library spot. So that may have been where you see a little bit more of a jump. So for example, some libraries may have weeded out more books than another library. So you might see some small differences there as well. But if I look at 5.61 for Farmingville, 5.14 came just from the teachers there.
Yeah,
So
Farmingville is where we did have the 2 ads budget to budget on the classrooms.
that's right. Yeah. But you do just also keep in mind that they do, as much as we stayed with enrollment and stayed with a formula, if there was a school that said, I really need this, and the other schools may have not needed that. So I don't want us to think that we just completely boxed ourselves into a formula. Generally speaking, that's where we landed. But there may be a school that had a particular need that another school didn't have.
Any other questions at the elementary level for now? Moving on to middle schools, we had 1 ad of the SRBI behavior interventionist for 105. Does anybody have any concerns to raise on that ad? It didn't sound like it on Saturday, but double checking. Any other concerns about staffing in general or in specific at either of the 2 middle schools or at line item level on either? Really quite minor changes there. Clear to move on from middle schools? On to the high school. We were all happy with the number at the end of the presentation the other day, but any questions about the high school, either staffing wise or on the line item level? I did have a question on staffing. On the business department, we're projecting to go from 15 sections to 20, and I'm just curious as to why we're assuming that kind of a jump.
Karen, you want to take that one?
I will. That's also a budget to projection. We saw that increase this year. So we are actually proposing to keep the current staffing flat at that increased rate.
If you can make these tables 3-dimensional and we can see it to budget and to actual some way, that would be great. But
you know what, Jonathan, you're not wrong about that. I think that is something that I know Dawn is probably going to close her ears right now, but I do think could add transparency to the budget book is that 3rd column. I know she blacked her ears on that one, and I'm not sure. I'm sure we could figure out how to do it, but I do think that can be a little confusing as we process through this. At least for myself, I have to always circle back to what's actual versus what we projected.
Got it. So it's not that we're thinking next year they'll need 20, although they only needed 15 this year. They actually did need 20 this year. Thank you. Okay. That answers my main question on staffing there. Other staffing questions or concerns at the high school level? One thing on the next page on the certified staff, non-certified classroom staff page, the bottom of the left column should be also 19.26.
Yep, I was just going to say that. Yep.
There is no change, but there's just a typo in the total at the bottom left.
Hang on a minute. So the budget is 18, you're saying?
If you add up the budget, it's actually 19.26.
Yep.
It didn't catch the formula.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thank you for catching that, John.
Yeah, I spent like an hour trying to figure out what I was doing wrong.
We do have the reduction of 1 AP here on the same page. This has been something that has been brought up a few different times over the past 3-4 years that I've been on the board. And I know that did give you some flexibility to make some kind of trade-offs. Do you have anybody unclear about how that all netted out? I know we went through it on Saturday, but there were some moving parts.
There was, and I do, because I know enrollment is a big topic of conversation. This decision really wasn't based on enrollment. And I just want to make sure that I emphasize that, because there could be 3 or 4 years down the line where the principal is making a recommendation to restructure again. But again, that shift that we made ultimately did save us $100,000, even though it may seem like we have more administrative heads. In reality, we do and we don't. We've extended their time. We're getting a lot of bang for our buck there. We're still saving $100,000, and we're looking at what our needs are right now, which could shift again down the line. So I just want to be sure that I articulate that, and don't hold us to the fact that we don't need 4 leaders, but we need a different type. We need different types of leaders right now.
Right. Where, speaking of that counseling supervisor, where do we find that in the, or does that show up as a change in the staffing page here?
The change you'll see in the special education budget.
I think it's under special education.
Actually, the counseling one is in the PPS budget and the special ed one is in the special ed budget, but counseling's under PPS.
Perfect, thank you. Line item questions on the financials for the high school budget. Again, they came in at, what was their 1.2% overall. Anyone? No, good. Athletics. This is one where I had a bit of a challenge understanding the dollar growth myself, but do we have questions on athletics here from anybody else? Liz.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I think I just look at this in relation to other things, and it's more of, again, sort of a macro level question. It looks like we're going up, what, 17% in athletics? And I look at the growth in the other areas, and I just wonder, are there things in here that we can do without this year? It's already going to be a big hit on the community. And I'm a supporter of athletics, don't get me wrong. And I actually think that the reduction of pay to play makes sense, but I just wonder if there are other ways, or a less dramatic reduction we can do there, or something else we can do to bring in more revenue, office supplies, things like that. There's just some really big swings. And I guess it's a 15% increase compared to all the other departments that are education driven, which sports are a part of the community, but so is music and theater and everything else. It just seems off to me that we would go up that high in 1 year versus all of the other pieces. So for me, it makes me uncomfortable. I think it seems a little off in terms of our priorities too. So it's more of a comment than a question, and it's not a line item, but I am highly concerned that we're seeing a drop in gate receipts. We're raising all the participation fees that the community has to pay for everyone all in 1 year. So 15% versus a 1% increase at most of the schools. I don't know. It just feels very uncomfortable to me.
Jonathan, am I hearing that you want us to come back by the 14th and perhaps take a relook at athletics and see what we can do there?
Well, I definitely would be more encouraged by that. I think it's fair to the community to have some options.
I don't say this terribly frequently, but I agree with Liz. It's optically, it's a strikingly large percentage increase, if you will. Even if you look at their overall budget, which was on a different slide, which takes into account not just the money from the Board of Ed, it's a 9.5% overall increase in the budget, whether it comes from our pockets or from P2P or whatever else. It is a 9.5% increase for the cost of the athletics department. Ken?
And this is going to be a question for Dawn, maybe for Dane, but what part of the switch from the accounting methodology is responsible for the increases? So because we're pulling out the revenues that normally we would have put in, has that already been accounted for in the budget? Because the budget to the 2021-22 budget did not have the changes in it. The 2022-23 budget does. Is that
so?
accurate?
My back of the napkin on this, Ken, is that all it looks like 15% here.
Right.
If you back out the P2P change, it's 12. But if you look at the overall budget for the department, not what the funding source is, what is being spent by athletics, it's up 9.5%. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, that part makes sense. I wanted to give them an opportunity to address that part, if that had been looked at and adjusted.
Selena.
So I agree that the number looks high also. But if you decide to back out P2P and you're telling the community, well, gee, I want to help you because, you know, I don't want the school budget to be so high because it's a tax increase. But then you tell them, but gee, you're going to have to pay, you know, how many hundreds of dollars for your children to play. And I think we're doing it in increments, right? So this year, you don't have to pay quite as much. Next year, you have to pay a little bit less and a little bit less, which I think is a really good idea. I think that's kind of, you're telling them in one sense you want to save money on the budget, but then you're just making them pay for something else. And the same with raising ticket prices, right? If I have 3 kids, it's going to cost me $30 as opposed to $15. So I think you have to be careful what you decide to take out of that budget, because you're going to make the public pay either way. And none of my children played sports. Unfortunately, I really did want a runner. Sorry, kids, if you're watching this, but I mean, you know, they were cheerleaders, I think, like 1 year, whatever. But I'm a supporter of sports for sure, athletics, but I just think you have to be careful what you decide to take out. But I mean, I do agree too, it's a little bit high. I'm hoping we can bring the budget down because people are struggling, but it's a school budget too. So this is hard for me right now.
Thanks,
I hate
Selena.
this season.
Sean and then Tom.
Sean, I think you're on mute. Well, I know you are actually. Here you
First
go.
Zoom, Sean?
Too many mutes here. I've got like 6 mutes here. So in on one hand, we're yes, we're telling sports families pay less. Unfortunately, that means everybody else is paying for those sports families, like Selena just said. So I know we have more than 50% of the kids that are sports kids. My kids were not either. We're asking the rest of the town to step up and pay their way, which I'm not sure I fully agree with. Secondly, you know, this is, as we said at the beginning, kind of an outsized increase compared to the average, compared to the last few years. Did I sleep through it, or did I not hear where we said what the status quo budget would have been?
What do you mean by the status quo, Sean?
Typically, we start out by saying, if we did nothing, our status quo budget with programmatic increases would have been X, but we're asking for Y. I know we did that last year and we did it the year before.
We did not do it this year. If that's something you want us to do, we could bring that to you on the 14th.
I think it's fairly typical. I could be wrong though.
It's typical. I don't know if I've ever found it particularly helpful, but
it's definitely helpful when marketing a budget like this. You know, last year, I think our number was below status quo. That was an important data point for a lot of people. If status quo is 1.2% and we're asking for 5, that's important to know.
I don't know if we have consensus, Dr. De Silva, but the consensus I do hear is that I think the board would like to hear some options as far as reductions in the athletics budget. I'd be happy if we found reductions, but kept that P2P reduction in place as well. I'd like to see something separate from that to keep the idea of moving towards P2P list future intact. But I think we're all open to seeing some change.
So I think it'd be best if we met with Dane and have him. Philosophically, I think that this board does have the appetite to begin transitioning, whether it's $25, $20, $15 into a model that at least reduces that cost for families. And Sean, while I agree with you, is it everyone that's paying for the athletic kid? It is programmatically different than others, right? In the music program, the kids have to pay for a thing here or there, but do they have to pay to actually participate? They don't, right? You're on mute. I think.
Instruments are not cheap. So yes, they do.
Yeah, you're right. Instruments are cheap, and I think we're working towards making that situation better as well. But you're right. But I guess with athletics, there's things that kids pay for too. But anyway, my point with it is I do think that the conversation has to happen with Dane, and perhaps on the 14th we can bring a couple of different options to the board to consider.
Because that also includes adding rugby as a sport too, I believe.
Yeah, and I definitely heard Dane feel very strongly about keeping rugby. There's a process, and once you take the process away, then you take the fidelity away from kids and saying, well, if we did it as a club and then it's supposed to become, a sport, a team, and now you're not allowing that. I felt that passion from Dane on Saturday, and I think I feel just as strongly. There are some options. Remember, not only did he remove the pay to participate, but he also increased the supervision and time in the weight room. And the fees there. So maybe there's an option there. But again, I don't want to speak for Dane. In the conversations that I've had, I know that that's probably where he would land before rugby, for example. But I'll bring something back on the 14th.
I think with regards to rugby, this board has already been presented and either officially or tacitly approved the process to go from club to team sport. So I wouldn't recommend that we go against making that change to rugby at this point. If we wanted to make a change to that process in the future, that'd be a different story in my mind. But again, I think show us some options is where we can leave it for tonight. Does that make sense, team?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you all on the rugby thing. I think those kids have worked to get that on the docket.
Yeah, they earned it. All right. Again, it's a big increase on the athletics budget, but the athletics budget increase is not a big piece of the overall budget increase.
Right.
It is worth this discussion. Now we can move into the district-wide pieces, starting with curriculum and instruction. Questions or concerns on the staffing pages on curriculum and instruction? No changes being made there. And on the line by line side, we're looking at a $500,000 increase. Most of that is in two lines. I'm assuming the math resource is 165,000. That's the placeholder, depending on which.
And the math itself, I think, is 137.
132.
Okay.
132, and then there's some professional learning that comes along with it. And then if you remember the other difference, Jonathan, is the shift in the technology resources.
The digital instruction materials.
Yeah. And in the document that Ms. Flogel requested, I believe you'll be able to see the two parallels.
Right. So that's not a net 216,000 increase. It's just a move to curriculum from technology.
Correct.
While
it wasn't exactly apples to apples in Wes's budget, he did describe the difference in where the ads came in. So you couldn't see it exactly, but he did describe that on Saturday.
Liz?
I have a question on the curriculum line item. Can you explain what the assessment standards increase is? It's a pretty significant increase year over year. It went, and I don't know what the actuals were this year, but it jumped from $24,000 to $85,000. It's page 1 of the curriculum budget report.
Yes, that's another line. That's another line that we took off of technologies line. That includes the NWEA, Ames Web, all of those assessments. It really belongs in my budget, not Wes's. So that's just another example of a transfer.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Flogel, just Liz, also it cuts off the word, it's standardized. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Thank you.
That truncated column leads to so many So many questions.
It does.
Let's add another column so that we can have just the first couple letters. And see how
I knew what she meant. I knew what she meant.
I think my first year I went on a fish hunt for something. There was one like line that was cut off. I couldn't understand it. It took me like 3 days to figure it out, and then I knew.
Hey, Jonathan, can I ask?
You have a question? Yeah, you got a little yellow hand in the top
Yeah,
left of your screen.
this was back to the sports. I was after Sean.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I lost track of you there.
No, I just wanted to put a comment. I guess I'm a little late now to the sports party, but Dane gave a very good presentation over the weekend that explained the various options in pretty good detail. So I'd ask people just to watch that again. And I also want to make a point about, I know firsthand how all the coaches and athletic staff were instrumental in helping many students through the pandemic and the school closures. So we certainly don't want to send the wrong message that we're not supportive of those extraordinary efforts that the athletics department made during the COVID and still during COVID. Just wanted to point that out.
Absolutely. Point well taken.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, anything else on either athletics or curriculum? I'd like I think it's already been asked for. Can we get a difference and percent difference in curriculum budget, taking out those moves, so we get a real feel for what the actual increase is there?
So if we remove the shifts that we made from technology into curriculum, what that number would be? Okay.
Yeah.
We can get that.
a year over year on pure curriculum.
Yeah.
Right. Sure.
So it's always makes sense to align things where they belong, but for budgets, it makes it kind of difficult sometimes to see what's what.
Mm-hmm.
Facilities. Any questions on the way Joe is throwing away our money again? Liz.
Just an ask. I know that the innovative furniture is a ask, and I know we may push it off a year, but I know 100,000 in the context of the whole budget isn't a lot, but it seems a little bit like, given all of the increases we need to make on special ed, that may be an easy cut point for the facilities budget. Just an option.
Good point. Anybody else?
It is a good point, Jonathan. If I could just make a counterpoint, and ultimately it ends up getting cut. I hate to say it.
It always does.
When you go into our schools and you see the furniture, Liz, it may end up there anyway. You know, it very well may be, but when you go see the furniture, you understand why they make the requests, consistently each year. And when it comes down to projects that come up, and the reality is they do. I mean, we saw it with the tank at the high school. There's just things that come up. That is ultimately where it lands. And so while I understand that we may end up making that decision before we actually make the decision operationally, and I hope our principals went to bed, it almost always gets cut. I hate to say it, but it does. Joe, am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right.
Just to clarify, though, this is not replacing excellent furniture with more innovative, excellent furniture. It's replacing
old furniture,
end of life furniture with.
Yeah.
We should just call it new furniture as opposed to maybe losing the word innovative would help its cause.
It probably, and I'll say this is when we made the move, from our old offices to our new offices, some of the furniture, because they weren't real offices, they were like cubicles, right? So that furniture couldn't actually go into an office. We had our principals literally coming and taking furniture that has been around for 15 years, that when you move it, it breaks, but it was still better than what they had in their schools. And so, at the end of the day, we will certainly prioritize and do what we need to do. But, the situation in our schools is not great. And that's from, direct impact on kids to just the indirect, when you go into some of these conference rooms and you have mismatched chairs and tables that are put together from Costco.
Not to bag on Costco. I understand. I'm looking for opportunities here because it is a big lift overall.
Understood.
How much of the change here is fuel?
The big driver was oil. That was the, we went up, what I said, $1 a gallon. So when you look at our whole profile, 225,000 gallons, and considering where we were with a very favorable pricing, yeah, that the biggest chunk was fuel oil.
How long have you had the same staffing levels in your department?
It has decreased over. I've been here 13, so it has decreased a little bit, probably by 4.
Budget reasons,
Correct.
not choice.
Correct.
Any other questions on the line item level of facilities? Again, this is the department that usually, when push gets to shove, gets cut whether we like it or not. I'm loath to recommend a cut.
Well, I think the other option here is, and I don't know when the last time we looked at our capitalization rules, but maybe there's some additional capital improvements that we could use to fix things like, I mean, a chair has a 3 to 7 year life cycle. I don't know, maybe there's something we can do there to really assess how we're accounting for some of this so that it has a longer depreciation cycle potentially. So just something to consider.
Good point.
Any other facilities questions? Line item or staffing levels? Okay. Next piece is general services. I know this was kind of a weak presentation on Saturday, but
Jonathan, I don't know if Tom's hand is still up or if that's from before.
Tom?
No, that was from before. Sorry, I just don't know how to take it down.
Okay.
You click on the feature again, Tom, the raise hand. All right.
General services. Starting with staffing, any questions there?
I have one, as
Shoot.
usual. And I know you explained this to me last year, so I'm going to apologize because I don't remember the answer and I can't find it in my notes. The management consultant line item on page 2 of the general services budget. It's going up 2%, and I cannot remember for the life of me what that covered.
Management consult.
Yeah, it's on page 2 of the general services budget, first line on the page 2.
Yeah, management consultants are anytime that we have an outside consultant come in to do research on anything that we have. We have typically transportation. We have some analysis done on. We have any analysis come in for
technology.
Technology, yeah, any area. It's district wide that there's going to be somebody that comes in and does any analysis in there.
So what is the 30,000 based on? Do we have a list of projects or target areas that we think we're going to use it for this year?
We have a list. I can get you the list. We also have some general costs in there as well, Liz. Let me get you that cost.
Maybe you can get us year-to-date actuals too. That would help.
Yeah, that would help as well. I know it got dropped down last year pretty dramatically, which is good, but whenever I see consulting lines, I question.
Yeah, I think the reason that may have gone down so dramatically, Liz, and I'll have to get the backup on it, but I want to say that in Rob Miller / Wes DeSantis's vacant position, we had a consultant there. But so that's why the big drop, but I had to get the backup. So we'll get you the backup on that.
Okay, thank you.
And then we are going down one bookkeeper. Is that expected to stay with 3 instead of 4 going forward?
Dawn, would you like me to
yes, please
respond to that, or would you? Okay, sure. It's actually a reclassification. We had a resignation with the bookkeeper, and we are replacing it with a non-union position. So it's coming out of that line, and you'll see an addition line where it says assistant business manager.
Got it.
So that's the one FTE exchange.
Perfect.
Thank you, Karen.
Anything else? It's easier on these departments that are below the district average on their percent increase, right?
And keep in mind that there will be some areas that I'll bring back as soon as I have hard numbers, the benefits, OPEB, pension, liability insurance. I should have all those soon.
Great.
And just to follow up, Dr. DeSantis was listening in. So that line did drop, Liz Flogel, from the management consultants because of that vacant position that we had that, if you remember, Dave Monzaleski was filling in.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Pupil personnel. We have the one.
I think that we should have Dr. Hanaway present one more time.
Go for it.
No, I'm doing the road
All right,
show.
you want to share your screen? So we see the guidance chair here, right?
Yeah, the replacement of the guidance chair for the supervisor.
Right.
So this one's a hard one-to-one because remember,
Right.
the individual is a teacher for part of the time, department chair leader for part of the time, and now shifting over to that 12-month position.
And then we're keeping the one reduction in nursing because we have made it through this year with that reduction. And
Yeah, it's an inconsistent need, which we find better to staff through agency work instead of a committed Board of Ed employee.
Right.
That said, if we did need a committed Board of Ed employee, this is one of those spaces, whether it, contingency or lack thereof isn't just for certified staff. Sometimes you need a nurse, sometimes you need another interventionist. Those are things that are just going to come up. And unfortunately, they come up after our budget's been approved.
Tuition expulsion outplacement.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a known need for next year?
So we're required, students who are expelled continue to be educated by the public school district. And there was for a very long time, up until the last few years, most often these students received a form of tutoring in order to fulfill their credits. The state revamped guidance to districts and even regulation to say you need to offer something more robust than that, but it has to be tailored to meet the student's individual needs, depending on the length of their expulsion and the experience that they may have during that period of time. We have had a need for specific situations for students to have something other than tutoring, but to actually attend a program. And there are local programs that will do a semester at a time, like legit placement rather than an as needed tutoring situation. So we increased this because we've had 2 years in a row of the need for it, not budgeted. We were able to figure it out, and it's for very, very short periods of time, but 2 years is enough for me to say, I think it's something that we need to budget for next year.
So it's been spent, but without being budgeted. Now we're putting it in the budget.
In both of these situations, or in the situations that I'm referencing, the time in which the expulsion lasted and how long they'd be in the program, the families sometimes had a preference of not starting a new program and disrupting them, that they could just do tutoring and come back. Whereas, if it was just a few months longer, they might have been in a program. So it's a little bit of a rolling of the dice to assume that tutoring is going to suffice. So that's why we budget for the tuition.
With everything that the district has gone through and faced over the past 5 years or so, to see pupil personnel flat or even a slightly down budget is I've got nothing to complain about there.
Yeah, and there have been questions from the community, and we'd be happy to speak about it further about our investment over the last 10 years in pupil personnel. namely psychologists and social workers. We've had a pretty dramatic increase in the last 10 years, less so school counselors, those have been pretty flat, but we also had a pretty dramatic shift in our behaviorists, which aren't in pupil personnel, they're in special ed, but they all work together. So the larger investment in that whole capacity of professionals has been pretty big. And, we didn't ask for another pupil personnel provider this coming year. Yes, there's been a tremendous amount of talk about mental health. We didn't ask for another one because frankly, we'd rather invest in more people, more teachers, more providers being able to support kids are in front of them instead of trying to find that one person in the building. It's just, we felt like it was a better way to go.
Selena.
I think this was answered the other day. Magnet, that's for transportation, right?
Well, we have to pay for both. We have to pay for tuition, part of a tuition for magnet school and transportation. We also pay for transportation to St. Mary's and Richfield Academy.
Okay, because you mentioned, I know we talked about possibly purchasing vans.
So we, Joe, I ask him every day.
I absolutely love that idea. I mean, that will save us so much money in the future.
This and snow days. That's what, when you call it, you just hope for. So they're on order, but so is my car 5 months ago. So,
So Selena, part of the known is what we're trying to use the transportation, the van for, the vehicle for. We've had a very inconsistent enrollment in magnet schools.
Mm-hmm.
So to plan to use that vehicle for that is less reliable than it would be like a private special ed placement.
And moreover, the cost is less. What Dr. did a great job of in her presentation tonight is to share the cost of special education transportation for one student, which could be $70,000. That's average. We have transportation that's $120,000 for a student. So the purchasing of the van for the purpose of the magnet school, at this point, just with the, we'll see. It's a pilot. It's intended to be that, and we'll get feedback and know, where the future lies with respect to them. But for right now, we're hoping to leverage the vans with those high cost transportation students.
The other thing I'll add,
no Uber, huh?
We don't live in an area where there's a lot of magnet for elementary.
Yeah.
Other parts of the state have magnet for younger kids. So the necessity for transportation is obviously greater. Most of our students who attend magnets are driving themselves also at a certain point in high school.
Okay. Just wondering about that.
Mm-hmm. And Selena, we also provide nurses for those two schools as well.
Anything else on pupil personnel before we move straight into special education? Okay, special education it is. Who wants to start? Frankly, there's a lot of changes and a lot of growth, but I don't have a lot of questions here. I think this has all been very much answered. Do we have any lingering questions or concerns on the special education side?
I just have one.
Sure.
It's about the secretary line going up 8% in 1 year. I'm just curious. I don't know where the actuals netted out for this year, but can you walk through that one? It's on page 1, midway through. Secretary sped.
Karen, do you want to do it? Do you want me to?
No, that's fine. So it's a combination of negotiations and the contractual wage obligation. And there was a job classification change for both the secretaries in the special ed department from administrative assistant to bookkeeper.
Which is far more in line to their responsibility.
Right.
So right now, for example, excess costs, which you heard Tony speak of, those individuals track the costs of each of those students, literally from the tissue box to the transportation to everything that individual student costs us. And so, our ability to navigate excess costs as successfully as we have been is a testament to the work of those individuals. However, the reason that it's 8.35 isn't necessarily because of the testament of the work that they are doing, but because we reclassified them to really align them to the work that's actually happening, that they're responsible for.
Got it. Thank you.
Anything else on special education? No. Before we move to technology, I just wanted to circle back because I did skip transportation. Are there questions on transportation, which is not a separate tab, but it's in general services? Majority of the change there is in-town special ed, as we know. The AMPM contract, are we due for next year, or when do we see a revision, a new negotiation contract?
Current contract goes through next year.
For next year, so it'll be this coming year that we'll be looking at it.
So we'll begin the RFP process soon. And we'll talk more about that actually likely in executive session.
Thanks.
I'll just make my annual statement about transportation, creativity, and innovation, and an
That's
ask
why I
thereof
circled back.
before we go into the RFP. It's just it's such an excessive cost, and I know we have to legally provide it, but if there's anything creative other districts are doing, I'd say we start harvesting those ideas before we go to RFP.
So Liz, that point's well taken. I think you heard Dane's just touch upon it very briefly in his athletics presentation. There's lots of bits and pieces within our current contract that I think he would like to revisit just to make that situation better. But I think that there are, again, we'd have to really weigh financially what makes sense, but whether or not our own buses, a little bit bigger than a van, smaller than for a student, whether that's even is it reasonable for every sporting event, maybe for the smaller teams, perhaps. But we'll be collecting feedback from all of our cost centers on transportation and being as creative as possible. Certainly, I think there's no complaints right now with respect to our provider. We've been served well. But as we move forward, it's a big number. And we recognize that for general education and for special education.
Thank you.
Liz, that's why I circled back. I didn't want to.
It's my annual comment.
Absolutely. So now technology. Doesn't have to be all Sean, but who else has questions on the technology side? Can't hear you, Sean.
There it goes. So I'll just reiterate that I'd like to see all of our subscriptions on one page, not just IT across the board, because IT's got a ton of them. I'd just like to see where they all are, because those are programmatic things that get increased and happen automatically for the next X amount of years. So
I believe that's already on our Q&A. If it's not, it'll be there in the next day or two.
Yeah, and it should have cost and term and all that stuff.
Does anyone have any questions or concerns about the increase of one added technician? No.
There's the added technician, but remember there is the reduction in the 0.5 tech integrator, not because he doesn't need a tech integrator, but just half-time person. The one just doesn't stick.
I'd just say, knowing this space a little bit in my other life, I totally support having that person. You can't go to a one-to-one initiative and not have tech support for the people involved. So we're just moving to a digital age. So that unfortunately we're taking a little bit of a hit from starving that department for a couple of years. So
that has been the MO here for some years. It's not finding savings, it's putting spending off. It doesn't save anything in the end. The $640,000 increase in hardware, equipment, and technology, that is in no way able to be capitalized, correct? It's not a big purchase, it's a lot of small purchases.
Yeah, I don't think that I could articulate it as well as Wes did on Saturday or his earlier presentations, and we're glad to come back. But I think that he's been incredibly transparent. And quite frankly, there's a lot of moving forward that department would like to do, and we just have not been able to do it. And I think video production is one of those areas. And I know that he has a lot of creative ideas for others as well. But it's a reality. And if we have an opportunity to get through a walkthrough in this budget season, I think it would be really valuable for the board and the community to look at some of these spaces. The Mac Lab is a great example of just outdated 20-year-old computers. And as much as we might snicker about it on a Saturday when we've been poking around for 7 hours, kids having to burn things onto a CD-ROM to then put it onto a thumb drive. I mean, most of us don't even know what a thumb drive is anymore. And it's just not appropriate, and we're better than that. So no, I think that the answer to that question is, I think he really was thoughtful about it. This is going to be an ongoing budget hit that we're going to feel. And, but little by little, I think we're going to move towards innovation and some excitement for kids. And that is great news.
Thanks. Anything else on technology? We really reached the end at that point. The appendix just has all the same numbers on one sheet. You know, nothing really to point at there. It's a lot of equipment, and we just talked about it. A lot of salaries, and that's just contractual. There's not a lot of ads. Any other questions before we move on from this piece of the agenda? Again, we do have 2 weeks in which we can send more questions in, and we will be able to discuss this more on Monday, the 2 weeks from the 14th, is it? Our next meeting before we vote.
It's Valentine's Day. That's the next.
Wait, we're not doing this on Valentine's Day, are we?
Yeah, we are.
Oh, I might be sick that night.
Yep. Hopefully it'll be a short meeting.
Okay. If that's it, we can move right along to policies. Rachel, would you like to lead us?
Jonathan, I think we have December financials and transfers first.
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry about that. Next up is December financials and transfers. Dawn, would you like to start with the financials?
I'd be happy to. Real quick, we'll get through them. Before you is December, which is halfway through our fiscal year financials that we have. We're currently trending within budget in all areas except for special education. We expect to be trending over budget eventually in that area. We have expended or obligated about 97.7 million of our 102 million appropriated budget. And then there was a question last financials that I brought up, how long our electricity and our oil was locked in. So we locked in our electric contract to November 2022 at a rate of 0.10690 kilowatts per hour. And our oil bid at 2.4477 per gallon, we were able to lock in through June of 2022. So we got oil for the full year, and we have electric through November.
Thank you. Questions on the financials? If not, do I have a motion?
I move that the Board of Education accept the financial report ending December 31st, 2021.
I have a second. Ken, thank you. All those in favor of approving the December year-to-date financials, please raise your hands. Tom, is your hand raised? All right, we have eight approved. Thank you. Motion carries. Next up is the transfers. Let's start with the motion.
I move that the Board of Education approve the transfers as presented on January 24th, 2022.
Thanks, Rachel. Do I have a second? Ken, thanks. Dawn, you want to take us through the transfers?
Sure. We have a technology transfer that's before you for a movement from supplies to subscriptions. And this is to cover the cost of communication services and additional student required curriculum technology purchases that we needed to purchase. In athletics, we have some football material fall that we moved to boys ice hockey. And that's to cover the cost of additional needed hockey equipment materials that ran over budget for the hockey team. And that the football materials the funds were available because they were able to purchase the helmets with prior year funding, which alleviated the fact that they didn't have to cover that this year. Purchase service girls volleyball to office supplies. They had additional funds needed to cover the cost of awards and certificates. And the volleyball funds were available because they did not need all of their referee expenses by the time their season had ended. There was a little bit of funds available there. In special services, we had nurses' salary to professional ed services nurses, and that was due to the need to have a contracted nursing service for a specific student. In the high school, they have membership, administrative, and PD sub-salaries to move to the magnet school, and that was because during the budget process, they didn't anticipate as many students going to the magnet school as applied and were sent there, so they needed to move a little bit more money into the magnet school line. Athletics, the rest of the transfers that you see on there are athletics. So again, there were some funds available for materials football to boys ice hockey. And that was to purchase some additional uniform for two additional players that joined the team. There's purchase services girls field hockey and a little bit of the purchase service football. Transportation for girls field hockey. There's transportation for the next 4 line items, and mainly the transportation were needs because Tiger Hollow fields were not ready and therefore they weren't able to play at home. They needed to transport to other fields in order to play their games.
Thanks, Dawn. Any questions on the transfers from anyone? There being none, all those in favor of approving the transfers as presented, please raise your hands.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, I have one quick question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So just on the special services one, the 58,000. So it's my understanding, Dawn, from hearing you, that it was probably an emergency that was needed, right? Because as per our policy 3160, transfer of funds, anything over 50,000 should come to the board first before the transfer is made.
That transfer hasn't occurred.
Okay.
It was waiting for your approval before that transfer occurred. It's before you as an approval.
Excellent. Thank you, Dawn.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, all those in favor of approving the transfers as presented, please raise your hands. Tom, are you there? Motion carries 8 with 8 votes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Rachel, policies first read, starting with 6142.101 wellness.
Great. Oh, thank you, Jonathan. I just want to mention that all edits are to existing RPS policies except for wellness. So the first policy up for first read is wellness RPS policy 6142.101. It was last revised in 2009. It is in the Shipman and Goodwin model policy update. It is acquired policy by KEEB, and it's also mentioned in our KEEB audit to replace. Dr. Hanaway and Ms. Noto, a nutritionist, led the policy committee through a draft of the wellness policy presented before you this evening. And Dr. Hanaway, is there anything that you would like to add?
No, I think, well, yes, in brief, it's, if you look at the current policy versus this draft, there's a lot of differences in multiple sections, but namely in how the wellness committee functions, the way it sets goals, measures them, communicates out to the community. So there, it has a strong emphasis on the ongoing nature of the wellness committee to enact the regulations that the district would develop as a result of this policy. And we did include social and emotional wellness in the general wellness definition that was not included in the current version.
Dr. Hanaway, just for a clarification, page 2 of 3, we need to insert a title in the wellness policy. I'm assuming that's going to be the director of nursing. So before we bring it back for a second read, Rachel and Dr. Hanaway will add that in.
Yes, the director of nursing.
Are there any questions from board members?
Does not appear to.
No.
This is the first read for everybody. The policies will come back to us for a second read before we approve.
Great. Thank you. So the next two policies up for our first read are 5141.2 immunizations and 5141.3 health assessments. So just a little background first. Health assessments and immunizations are currently in one policy, 5141.3. The last time this policy was revised was in 2015. The model language in our current policy is the administration regulations as per the Shipman and Goodwin model for health assessments and immunizations. The two were combined verbatim and adopted in 2015 to form our current policy. So in preparation for our discussion as a committee on whether we can adopt regulations as policy, I sought out administrative input and legal counsel. The resolution is we can do this as a board under bylaw 9313. I just want to read it for all board members. We went over this in our policy committee meeting. So the board does not adopt administrative regulations unless specifically required to do so by law or unless requested to do so by the superintendent. So with Dr. De Silva's input, as well as legal counsel, we may keep this as policy. And what was recommended in committee was to just separate the two titles, just as Shipman and Goodwin presents them, and bring them forth to the full board today for consideration. So I just wanted to give that as background first. We will start with the immunizations, 5141.2. Are there any questions?
Please.
Obviously, religious exemptions hold a lot of emotional influence for people in the community and around the state. It's been a very politically driven hot topic. Why would we put redundant information or different information? I'm not sure if this is, as I don't know the actual legislation that passed about the religious exemption that was dealt with at the state level. Why do we need this in our local policy book at all? It's a state law.
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I was going to say, so it is a recommended policy by CABE, Liz, to your
That's why I'm asking, what's the rationale for putting it in the RPS policy book? If it's already a state law, why do we need to be redundant to that?
We don't have to. In other words, we don't have to be redundant, but by having the right, so CABE has a policy. Shipman and Goodwin doesn't have a policy. Shipman and Goodwin has regulations. Because we've had the regulations as policy in the past. Looking at the CABE policy, we didn't really, the language just wasn't as clear as the policy. With respect to your question, Liz, which is why have it as policy if it's state law? Most families refer to policy. They don't necessarily go digging through the state law. So by having a policy that's—
In this case, I would dispute that, actually, given the amount of energy and emotional reaction for a political body telling you what your religious exemption or not should be. There is a ton of education in this space. And I would argue that that's not a true statement, that most families actually do go to the law and actually fight it at the legal level.
Sure.
And that's probably why we don't want it in our policy, because then it becomes a legal battle for RPS versus the state of Connecticut.
Don't we have a lot of policies that are also law?
We do.
Liz, I get your point that this might feel different. I'm just clarifying that there are plenty of policies that are.
I'd love to understand which ones, because this one in particular has a ton of political elements to it. And frankly, by adding it to our policy book this year, given all of the concerns around immunizations, whether you believe them or not, or agree with them or not, seems ill-timed at best to me.
Got it. Anybody else? Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, looking at this as the way sometimes legislation is analyzed in the court system, by including this in the policy manual, what's the harm?
And by that same token, what's the benefit?
Well, what's the benefit doesn't really answer.
The benefit is that no parent can come and say, well, Ridgefield didn't tell me, or I was confused. I mean, it seems like it would protect us more legally because we're bound by law.
Or get us into the court system more. I mean, look, if a parent is confused about religious exemptions, how many parents have we had that are confused about religious exemptions? We have data.
It's my turn.
Yeah, Selena, go ahead, and then we'll take the next hands.
We don't dictate public health policy. We don't dictate it. None of us are physicians. We don't dictate it. So we could use the terms, we adhere to the law, but you do write it out typically. I mean, we have a bullying policy, and part of our bullying policy speaks to the law of Connecticut. So most of our law, it's the law to go to school, and we spell that out in our truancy law, in our truancy policy. So I think Tom's right. I mean, there is no harm.
Excellent.
I disagree with you wholeheartedly.
Hold on, Liz, hold on.
So
Liz,
I will stop
please.
there, but
Liz.
I disagree.
Tom, I mean,
Okay.
we do need to respect.
I'm sorry, I have the chair.
I'm sorry.
Do I have any other questions? Are there any questions about the policy itself, not whether or not you'd like to vote for it or against it? Are there questions for clarity?
Yeah, it implies, can you clarify that
Liz.
we are respecting the religious exemptions that were in before April 28th? That in section C, I think it's 2C, the wording is a little bit clunky is the best word I could use for it, to ensure that any family who transfers in with a religious exemption prior to that date is in fact compliant with their religious exemption. It's just that the way it's worded is a little bit off.
Liz, I'm sorry.
On page 4.
Page 4 of 6, section 2C.
So Liz, if I am correct, that is the wording that is used in Public Act number 21-6.
Why not just refer to the Public Act then?
Well,
Finding public acts is not the easiest thing in the world.
Are there any other questions?
I have a great deal of respect for the ability of our Ridgefield parents to be able to find what they need.
I do like an organic conversation once in a while, but we would really benefit ourselves if we could maintain decorum. Tom, and then Selena.
Yeah, my comment on finding public acts is not the easiest thing in the world was not meant to imply that Ridgefield parents are not intelligent enough to find it, as the comment implied from my colleague. Ridgefield parents are busy. They have a lot of things on their plate, and just referring to a public act is not the easiest thing for them to do. This is completely harmless. It's just a statement of state law. There's no, whether it's in or out, quite frankly, is irrelevant because it is the state law. But I think we're making more of a mountain out of a molehill.
Thanks, Tom. Selena, do you have another question?
So either all our policies are the same, we need to be consistent. So we just say we follow the law for truancy. We're either consistent or we're not. So we can't just go, we make a statement by not writing out the law, the act, HB 6423. And it is confusing because some children are grandfathered in, and it's better to spell that out. And we need to be compliant as far as that goes. That is confusing. We need to make sure children understand that.
Thanks, Lynn.
Parents understand that.
Thanks. Are there other questions? Dr. De Silva, do you want to say something?
Just Jonathan, I just want to be clear. We've had this policy before. So there are certainly changes, as Liz described, specific to the religious piece, but there are other subtle changes too. So that's when we we look at our policies in terms of revisions, oftentimes it's because, yes, there was an audit, but also because of new legislation, right? So as soon as we receive our legislative updates from our attorneys, that's when they get slated onto a committee meeting. And so both with immunizations, the next one, health screenings, whether it was guns in the past, whether it's new law, that's why they end up with policy. So I understand for sure that it is a topic that has drawn out emotions from many different constituents in different ways. And certainly, you know, I'm not here to opine on the political piece of it, but just want to be sure that we all understand that how the policies end up with us is because of new legislation and or an audit identifying that this is a reason. Or sometimes I have one today when, you know, when it comes to just something that's practically no longer, it doesn't make sense any longer. And that's, you know, another reason that they end up at the policy committee. Yeah.
Thank you. Ken, you have a question?
It was a clarification, and I know we had discussed a lot of policies at policy committee. Did Shipman and Goodwin recommend that we have this policy or have this as policy?
Shipman doesn't have a policy. Shipman has regulations. Cade has a policy. In the past, we've used Shipman's regulations as policy for the bylaw that Rachel stated before. That's been 2015. So because we receive updates, Shipman as our attorney gives us all the new legislative and so we would have had revised regulations or revised policy. Because we already had it as policy, their regulations as policy, we just stuck to that. So this is no different than the structure that we already had. It's just we would have either revised the regulations or revised the policy. Since we had a policy that was based off of the regulations, that's what we revised.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on 5141.2? Thanks, everyone. 5141.3, Rachel?
Yes, any questions on that one? So again,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so again, this is exactly what we had. We're just splitting them apart and you'll see the corrections in front of you. The updated corrections.
I have two questions of
Rachel.
clarification on this policy.
Liz, you have a question?
Yeah. On section 3C, page 3 of 7, it suggests that the school employee can actually be in the oral health assessment with a student, and that parents could only opt out in a quote unquote reasonable opportunity. What is a reasonable opportunity? Who defines what reasonable is? It seems like it would open us up for some concern.
Dr. Silva, we could check with Aaron Cook. I know he went over this before it came to us this evening. Perhaps we could ask him that question.
And then I have a second one on page 5. It goes from page 5 to page 6 in section 7, other non-emergency invasive physical examinations. It says the district may from time to time require students to undergo additional non-emergency invasive physical examinations, which includes exposure of private body parts. Can someone explain to me the intent of this policy? And what circumstances would the district require invasive physical examinations for a student?
I believe that's another question for Aaron Cook. Dr. Silver, what do you?
Yeah, we'll have Aaron come, Liz, to answer that question in the second read. Is part 1 there the only one you have a question on?
Well, it's the whole section 7, the way it's written implies that the school can require invasive physical examinations on a non-emergency basis, which seems, and then that we should just give direct notice, not that there's an opt-out, not that they required to be there. The way it's written in sections A through C implies some pretty significant power on the part of the school to decide. And I don't know what these are for and what circumstances would drive this kind of ask and what the policy would be to request one.
So
I think a little clarity around this would be useful.
Yeah, I'll have Aaron come. This isn't a change from our past policy, but I think it's important that he be here to explain what that might look like from the medical point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Anything else on 5141.3? Okay, Rachel, 5113.2.
Okay, so this policy, attendance truancy and chronic absenteeism, as per the Shipman and Goodwin model policy update of fall 2021, they revised this policy and the accompanying administrative regulations to conform with section 19 of Public Act number 21-46, which requires local and regional boards of education to allow any student enrolled in grades kindergarten through 12 to take 2 non-consecutive days each school year as mental health wellness days. So as you see before you, the legal references are recommended to be updated in this policy. Also, the recommendation was made in committee to the first paragraph to use the word guardian to replace the words other person having control of the child. The regulations have changed. However, no vote is needed or discussion since regulations are not in the purview of the Board of Education. Are there any questions on this policy?
I don't see any questions here.
Great, thank you, everyone. And the next policy for first read is green cleaning. It's RPS policy 3524.2. This policy was revised recently on 6/28/21. As per the Shipman and Goodwin model policy full update of 2021, they revised this policy to make permanent one of the COVID-19 temporary revisions, which specifies that pursuant to Connecticut law, a Board of Education may use any cleaning product approved by federal law. You will find the amended language in the first paragraph. Are there any questions?
Just, I wanted to follow up. Rachel, Ken had a question around both the green cleaning and pesticide, which we're getting to, but I think the answer is the same in terms of notifications, Ken. Notifications to staff.
Mhm.
Right? That was your question, Ken?
That was one of the questions. We say we do, what do we do?
So Joe can speak to it, but we communicate directly to staff at the start of each year. Is that correct, Joe?
That's correct. The start of each year, we prepare a letter. It's basically a form letter that outlines all of our chemicals. It also reinforces the statement of bringing personal products into the school. And then with the COVID thing, we did adjust it according to the state, which included the alcohol and the hand sanitizer and a lot of the disinfectant cleaners that were not green.
I didn't know my camera was off. So that was the chuckle, Joe.
It was off.
Yeah, Dr. And I'm like, what do you mean my camera's off? I was just talking.
Any other questions here?
There was, I'm sorry, Jonathan.
Go ahead, Ken.
There was the other question of the bring in from parents, the ask for supplies, and the Clorox wipes used to wipe down the desks and the sinks and the faucets.
So that one, Joe didn't have I don't know that Joe would have the answer for, because I think our teachers do sometimes venture on their own. I think that is a school-based communication, but we'll follow up to make sure that that happens.
Yeah.
And then what are the consequences or result, or what would be a procedure for violating this particular policy?
Yeah, so that would be, progressive most often, more often than not, Ken, if someone violates it, it's because they didn't know, or they forgot, or they really, really wanted that table cleaned and they didn't think the green cleaning did it. I mean, I was a teacher once and I didn't think the green cleaning did it either. So I wanted my Clorox wipes and would bring in my contraband when everybody left. So we reminders and we go through the process of progressive discipline but most often than not, it's just people want their stuff clean and forget.
Well, but my point is making it is if it's a policy, then we have to enforce it. Is that so are we required to?
We are required to enforce it. And, I can't speak for the principals. To be fair, I think it's the occasion, not the rule. Then someone would bring in a product that is not allowed, that's not on that list.
And generally, they're very good about asking beforehand too. So, and then we just reference them back to the policy.
Okay,
I don't want to say it never happens, Ken, because I'm sure it does, but like many other things, right?
Okay, anything else here? Rachel, one more policy for you.
Yes. So the last policy for first read is pesticide application. This is RPS policy 3524.1. The last time this policy was revised was 2010. It is a CABE required policy. It is mentioned in the 2019 audit done by CABE. The last sentence is being recommended to be deleted, and legal references are recommended to be updated. Are there any questions?
Makes sense to me. I don't think we need that sentence anymore.
Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll answer those questions at our second read. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Good job. All right, moving out of discussion into information items, starting with enrollment report.
Okay, Dr. De Silva, if you don't mind, I will start. So we do have the monthly enrollment changes before you today. You will see that we do have, which is typical, some ins and outs across our schools, from a high with the most significant decrease at Ridgefield High School and the most increases at Barlow Mountain and the preschool, ultimately resulting in a total of 4,607 students that we educate, which is a net decrease of 2 students since the last report.
Thank you. You want to go right into the staffing report?
Sure. Okay. And again, as always, you will see the notifications of resignations or retirements that we've received since the last report. We continuously have changes throughout the year. So are there any specific questions about the staffing changes?
Does not appear so.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rachel, back to you with the correspondence report.
Okay, so Jonathan, at this time, there are no attendees, so I'm going to jump into the correspondence report.
Okay.
Okay. So our correspondence report, we have received 7 emails since our last Board of Education meeting. 2 emails regarded public record requests. 1 email regarded a public letter from Ridgefield Allies. 1 email regarded an upcoming event on teen sleep and school start times. 2 emails were in support of the superintendent's proposed budget, and 1 email was in regards to site positions and investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And we have come to the end of our agenda for tonight. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Ken, thank you. Do I have a second? Tina? Okay. All those in favor of adjourning, please raise your hands. As usual, it's unanimous. Thank you all very much. Have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow evening. Thank you.